It was generally agreed in St. Mary Mead that the late Colonel Geoffrey Ainsworth had chosen an inconvenient moment to die. Not that anyone said so in those words, of course. It was put more delicately, in terms of a pity, just as everything was so nicely settled. And such a disturbance, after all these years of quiet. The Colonel had lived at Old Forge House, a handsome but slightly shabby Georgian building at the far end of the village. He had not been exactly popular, but he had been, as Mrs. Bantry remarked, very much there, in the way that certain pieces of furniture are part of a room even if no one particularly likes them. His barking voice, his complaints about modern laxity, and his habit of writing letters to the Times had been as much a feature of St. Mary Mead as the church clock and the high hedge round Miss Marple's garden. On the afternoon of his funeral, the village turned out in respectful black. The church was full. The vicar spoke movingly of duty and service, and the Colonel's only son, Leonard, a pale man with a worried expression, stood stiffly at the front beside his handsome, expensively dressed wife, Irene. Miss Jane Marple sat 3 pews back, her neat black hat just visible above the prayer book she held. She listened attentively, though her faded blue eyes occasionally strayed, not irreverently, to her fellow mourners. She noted the tightness of Irene Ainsworth's mouth, the way the young widow dabbed at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She observed, too, the presence of certain people who might not, strictly speaking, have been expected. There was Mr. Julian Fielding, for instance, tall and well-tailored, with the faintly bored air of a man who frequented clubs in London and had opinions about port. He was introduced afterwards as the Colonel's godson. Then there was Dr. Owen Reed, the new doctor at the practice, who had attended the Colonel in his last illness, and whose dark, thoughtful gaze missed little. Most curious of all to Miss Marple's mind was the presence of Mrs. Celia Pryor, a gentle, timid widow from the neighboring village of Much Bramley, who seemed almost frightened to be there at all. She started nervously when spoken to, and her gloved hands twisted together like anxious birds. After the burial, those who were close to the family were invited back to Old Forge House for the funeral tea. In practice, this included anyone of consequence in St. Mary Mead and several who were not, but who managed to arrive all the same. The drawing room, with its faded chintz and heavy portraits of stern Ainsworth forebears, filled rapidly with murmuring voices and the faint clink of china. On a small side table, a silver kettle steamed beside a tiered stand of sandwiches and seed cake, presided over by Mrs. Finch, the Colonel's long-suffering housekeeper. She moved with red-eyed determination, her grief expressing itself in extra dollops of clotted cream. "I always say there's nothing like a death to bring people together," murmured Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple, as they found seats on a rather lumpy sofa. "Look at them all. I declare half this room has hardly set foot in Old Forge House these last 10 years. Miss Marple's knitting, black wool in deference to the occasion, lay quietly in her lap. Her eyes wandered, apparently vague, from group to group. Near the fireplace, Leonard Ainsworth spoke in low tones with Mr. Fielding, his brows drawn together. In the bay window, Dr. Reed stood with Irene, who laughed once, too shrilly for the day, some thought. A little apart from everyone, Mrs. Celia Pryor hovered by the door, as if longing to escape but too polite to do so. It was when the first plate of sandwiches had been passed and the conversation had settled into that particular subdued murmur of post-funeral talk that it happened. There was a sudden, strangled sound, a half-cough, half-choke from the center of the room. Every head turned. Mr. Julian Fielding had risen abruptly to his feet, his face an alarming shade of mottled red. His hand clutched at his throat with a dreadful, instinctive gesture. He tried to speak, but only a ghastly gurgling emerged. Someone cried out. A teacup smashed on the hearthstone. Dr. Reed sprang forward, pushing aside a small table so that cups and saucers crashed to the floor. "Air," he said sharply. "Stand back! Give him air!" But within seconds, swift, terrible seconds, it was clear that air would be of no more use to Julian Fielding than the fine walnut sideboard he collapsed against, dragging the lace runner with him as he fell heavily to the carpet, quite unmistakably dead. For perhaps half a minute, there was perfect silence in the drawing room at Old Forge House. Then came the first hysterical sob, the first frightened exclamation. Miss Marple's hands, resting on her knitting, were quite still. Her eyes, very clear and very sharp, rested not on the body on the carpet, nor on Dr. Reed bending over it, but on Mrs. Celia Pryor by the door. Pryor, whose face had suddenly gone as white as the linen on the tea-table. They went out into the lane together, Mrs. Bantry hastily snatching up a hat and an entirely impractical chiffon scarf, which she flung round her shoulders in what she must have supposed was an air of calm efficiency. Miss Marple, having only to collect her walking stick and carpet-bag, seemed rather as though she was setting out on some mild errand, taking soup to an invalid, or visiting the church flowers than going to view the aftermath of murder. The sky had darkened perceptibly, clouds gathering into a low grey ceiling over St. Mary Mead. The wind had begun to stir the hedgerows restlessly, sending a few early leaves skittering along the road before them. It was that curious, waiting kind of weather, Miss Marple reflected silently, when something seems about to happen. They had not gone 50 yards before they were hailed from a cottage gate. Mrs. Hart, stout, red-faced, and keenly alive to every nuance of village life, called out, "You'll have heard, then, about Mr. Blackwood? Shocking, I call it. Right in his own house, too. Mark my words, it's them as comes from outside brings trouble." "Indeed, Mrs. Hart." Miss Marple paused courteously. "I understood Mr. Blackwood had 6 guests last night. Such a pleasant number for conversation, though of course rather more for the servants to manage." Mrs. Hart sniffed. "Servants? Only that housekeeper and the daily, far as I know. But 6 of 'em there were, right enough. I seen 'em go past from my window. That Mrs. Dane with her fox fur all out of season, and Dr. Pemberton with his town ways, and that nephew of his, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Mark my words, Miss Marple, it's not natural, a man like Mr. Blackwood getting himself stabbed." "Well, murder rarely is, Mrs. Hart," said Dolly Bantry with unseemly enjoyment. "We really must be going. The doctor needs us at Blackwood House." She swelled with importance at the words. As they walked on, Dr. Haydock gave a little grunt. "Village knows everything within 10 minutes. Slack will love that." "Dear Inspector Slack," murmured Miss Marple. "He does so dislike it when other people have observations." "Interference, he calls it," said Dr. Haydock dryly. "Although, between ourselves, Miss Marple, I've never known your interference do him anything but good." Blackwood House came into view at the top of the lane, set a little back from the road behind tall yew hedges that had not been clipped this year as carefully as in the past. The house itself was of mellow brick, respectable and solid. It conveyed that air of prosperous privacy which some middle-aged men cultivate as others cultivate roses. A small knot of village children loitered by the gate, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. At the sight of Miss Marple, they straightened guiltily, as though she had caught them stealing apples. "Run along now," she said gently. "This is no place for you today." Inside the front door, which stood half open in mutely dramatic fashion, the hall was in some disorder. A hat lay on the floor as though dropped in haste, and there was mud on the tiles. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, not a relation, as everyone in St. Mary Mead could have told you, stood rigidly by a console table, clutching a handkerchief in one hand and the back of a chair with the other. "Oh, Miss Marple, ma'am, I'm that glad you've come," she burst out, with the peculiar illogicality of those who instinctively turn to the elderly in a crisis. "It's wicked, that's what it is. Wicked in a Christian house. Him lying there with a knife—" "Hush, Mrs. Blackwood," said Dr. Haydock firmly, but not unkindly. "Where is he now? Has anyone touched anything?" "In the study, sir. I shut the door like you said. I couldn't bear—" She broke off with a little sob. "I knew no good would come of last night. 6 for dinner is unlucky, that's what my mother always said. And look what's come of it." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the woman thoughtfully. You did not approve of Mr. Blackwood's guests, perhaps? She asked mildly. Mrs. Blackwood swallowed. It ain't for me to say, ma'am. Only there was a feeling, as you might say, a sort of— She groped for a word, then settled on atmosphere. Atmosphere, repeated Miss Marple gently. Yes, that can tell one quite a lot. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. If you'll excuse us, ladies, I'd better see Slacks not presented with a trampled crime scene. Miss Marple, I suppose you will want— If I might just look in from the doorway, said Miss Marple, with her air of apologizing for some small imposition. One does so like to be quite accurate in one's recollections, should there be an inquest. Dolly Bantry gave her a quick, excited look. Of course we'll look, she exclaimed. If there's a murderer about in St. Mary Mead, I, for one, should like to know what he looks like. Or she, observed Miss Marple placidly. They went together towards the study door, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps. As they approached, Miss Marple's gaze, apparently idle, travelled over the polished hall table, the row of pegs with their coats and hats, the umbrella stand with its neatly furled contents. Her eyes paused, very briefly, on a pair of wet footprints leading from the mat towards the back of the house, one of those small, untidy details that everyone else ignores. She said nothing at all about it. Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly as Dr. Haydock, with a murmured apology, disappeared toward the study. Simon made a restless movement as though to follow, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he sank into one of the stiff hall chairs, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. It doesn't make sense, he burst out suddenly. Uncle Theodore had enemies, of a sort, but not the kind to use knives. He was difficult, yes, hard in business, but murder. Few people, I have noticed, Miss Marple observed, seem the sort for murder until they have actually committed it. One hears that all the time in village discussions afterward. I never would have thought it of him. Or, she was always such a nice, quiet girl. People are very seldom what they seem, Mr. Blackwood. Simon pressed his lips together, then said abruptly, You were told about the dinner? We all left by 11:30. I saw Uncle go into his study with his brandy. He always did that. He liked to go over his papers before bed. I went up. I didn't— He broke off and rubbed his temples. I didn't hear anything. Not a sound. From the back of the house there came a murmur of masculine voices and the faint scraping of furniture being moved. Mrs. Payne? Clement shuddered, dabbing her eyes. It's wicked, she repeated under her breath. And after such a pleasant evening, too. The master was in one of his generous moods. He even opened the 21 port for Colonel Melchett. I should have known. What should you have known, my dear? Asked Miss Marple gently. Mrs. Clement hesitated. That something was wrong. You see, Miss Marple, Mr. Blackwood wasn't the sort to give without expecting something in return. He never invited people just for company. There was always a purpose. Purpose is very important, Miss Marple agreed mildly. And each of your 6 guests, did they seem at ease? At ease? Mrs. Clement sniffed. Miss Harrington Wells was nervous as a kitten, that I will say. Kept glancing at her husband as if she feared he'd say the wrong thing. He barely spoke at all, and when he did, it was to argue with the master about investments. Dr. Pemberton was charming, as always, asking after everyone's health, but there was a tension under it. Colonel Melchett drank more than usual. Mrs. Dane was bright as you please, but her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. And Mr. Simon here. She glanced guiltily at the young man. Well, I thought he looked worried. Simon flushed angrily. I just had a letter from London, that's all. My affairs are my own, Mrs. Clement. Of course they are, Miss Marple said soothingly. You had each, it seems, your own concerns. People do not leave those behind when they dress for dinner. They merely disguise them a little. The front door swung open with a gust of damp air and annoyed authority. Inspector Slack strode in, his coat unbuttoned and his expression already faintly exasperated. He nodded curtly to Dr. Haydock, who had reappeared from the study. Then his eyes fell on Miss Marple. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said with resignation. "Trust you to be on the spot. Mrs. Bantry's doing, I suppose." "I was merely taking tea," Miss Marple replied placidly. "One is so often near when something happens in a village." Slack's gaze moved to Simon and sharpened. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume. I'll need a full account of your movements since last night, and yours too, Mrs. Clement. The sooner we get the facts, the better." "Facts," Miss Marple mused quietly, her eyes drifting once more to the faint drying marks on the hall floor. "They are like crumbs on a tablecloth, Inspector. Quite useless until one notices which way they lead." Inspector Slack grunted, clearly uninterested in metaphorical crumbs. Yet, though he did not see it, Miss Marple had already begun to trace their direction in her mind. Inspector Slack's heavy tread and accompanying mutters echoed faintly from the dining room. Miss Marple, finding no one inclined to prevent her, rose with the air of a harmless elderly lady who had quite forgotten why she had stood up in the first place and drifted benignly after him. The dining room bore the marks of last night's dinner, the polished table gleaming under its lace runner, the silver candlesticks with the faintest run of wax on one side, as though a draught had troubled one flame more than the other. The sideboard, a massive mahogany piece, stood against the far wall, its lower doors firmly shut. "Ah," said Slack, seizing the opportunity for performance. "Here we are." He rattled the brass handle, then tried again more forcefully. "Locked, are we, Mrs. Clement, who had followed more hesitantly, produced her key ring with shaking hands. "I locked it myself after washing the knives, Inspector. The master liked everything kept proper." Miss Marple, hovering near the doorway, appeared to be preoccupied with straightening a chair cover. In reality, her eyes did not miss the way Slack's gaze flicked between Mrs. Clement's nervous face and Simon's strained one. The key turned with a dull click. Slack bent, opened the cupboard, and drew out a rectangular, velvet-lined case. "6 knives, you said?" he demanded. "Yes, Inspector. 6 to match the 6 places at table." Slack opened the case with an air of triumph that faded almost at once. 5 impressive carving knives lay in their individual slots, their polished blades reflecting the dim light. The 6th space was very clearly empty. "So," said Slack, swinging round, "1 knife missing, and we know where that is. Dr. Haydock found it in Mr. Blackwood's back. That's simple enough." "To some minds, perhaps," murmured Miss Marple, her tone bland. Slack shot her a dark look. "Facts are facts, Miss Marple. The weapon came from here. The housekeeper and the deceased had the only keys. One of them is dead. The other," he glanced pointedly at Mrs. Clement, "was safely in her room, I suppose. You did say you retired early after the guests left?" "I did, Inspector. Just after 11:30, Mrs. Clement spoke with injured dignity. "I'd no call to go down again till morning. I heard Mr. Blackwood go to his study about midnight. His door always creaked, but I never stirred, not with my arthritis. You may ask Cook. She'll say the same." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the back of the chair. "How very interesting. So Mr. Blackwood spent some time in his study after the guests departed. One wonders if he was perhaps expecting someone." Simon started. "Expecting someone?" But everyone had left. Colonel Melchett was the last to go, just before 11. I saw him out myself. "Did you, dear?" Miss Marple's tone was absent-minded. "And did your uncle lock the front door afterwards, do you recall?" Simon frowned. I don't remember. I went straight up. We'd argued a little over the estate. I was tired of the whole thing." Slack pounced. "Argued, did you? And now he's dead. Most convenient." Miss Marple's gaze had strayed to the window. A faint smear of something, grease or perhaps the vague mark of a hand, showed on the glass near the lower latch. The curtains, she noted, had been drawn from the right rather than the left, leaving an odd, imperfect meeting in the middle. "One can so easily forget to lock a door," she said soothingly. Though a man as particular as Mr. Blackwood would hardly forget twice. Once with the front door, And once with the, "Oh, but perhaps I am misremembering, Mrs. Clement. You found the back door unbolted this morning, did you not, Mrs.?" Clement looked startled. "Why, yes, Miss Marple. I was that shocked. The master was always strict about bolts and chains of a night. I thought perhaps I'd made a mistake." "People so often blame themselves," Miss Marple said gently, "when really, you know, they have been quite as careful as usual." Her eyes dropped just for a moment to the faint trace of moisture drying on the floor near the skirting board. A small mark, easily scrubbed away, but not yet fully gone. Someone, she thought, had passed this way in the small hours. Someone who preferred a less obvious route than the front door. "Inspector," she said mildly, "I wonder if, when you have finished with the sideboard, you might show me the study. I always think rooms where things happen can be so very enlightening." Slack grunted, but there was a reluctant assent in it. "If it keeps you from interfering elsewhere, Miss Marple, you may look all you like. Just don't touch anything." "Touch anything?" Miss Marple repeated vaguely. "Oh dear me, at my age one tries not to disturb anything at all." But inwardly, as she followed him toward the study, she was already considering that very old truth. People might lie, locks might be turned and bolts drawn, but floors, windows, and the little habits of daily life rarely did. The study at Blackwood House was a room that might have suited a minor statesman or a high court judge, rather than a village businessman. Dark shelves lined the walls, heavy with leather-bound volumes. The desk, a substantial piece of walnut, dominated the center. Behind it, in a large wing-backed chair, Theodore Blackwood sat unnaturally still, his body pitched slightly forward, his cheek resting almost gently on a blotter now stained as to darker shade. The carved silver handle of the missing knife projected grotesquely from his back. Inspector Slack halted just inside the doorway, his usual briskness checked for a moment by the grimness of the scene. Haydock moved forward with professional composure, though his jaw tightened as he examined the body. "Dead at least several hours," he said quietly. "I would estimate between midnight and 2 in the morning. Rigor is well established." The blow was firm and downward, delivered by someone standing behind him, most likely while he was seated. Miss Marple did not approach the body. She stood instead in the doorway, her keen eyes traveling calmly about the room. The desk was neatly arranged, correspondence stacked in precise piles. A single fountain pen lay deliberately parallel to the blotter, an inkstand without a trace of spillage. Only one object seemed out of keeping, an overturned photograph frame lying face down on the carpet near the hearth. "Odd," she observed mildly to no one in particular. "Such a tidy gentleman, and yet a photograph left upon the floor." Slack, who had been circling the desk, pounced on a half-burned sheet of paper in the fireplace grate. "Ah, now this looks promising. Someone tried to burn a document and thought better of it. Typical. Criminals never do things properly." With a pair of tongs, he removed the charred paper and placed it carefully on the desk. Only a few words had escaped the flames. "Cannot allow this to continue. Truth will out. 6 of you." "6," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very consistent." Inspector Slack glanced sharply at her. "You seem remarkably interested in that particular number, Miss Marple." "It is merely that people so often arrange things in patterns," she said demurely. "It is human nature, I suppose. One sees it very clearly with crochet motifs, little groups of 3 or 6. They do repeat themselves." Her eyes had not left the overturned frame. When Slack moved to the window to examine the latch, secure, with no sign of tampering, she bent, apparently adjusting her shoe, and with a light hand righted the frame. The photograph within showed a much younger Theodore Blackwood, flanked by 2 other men and a woman in a cloche hat. The men wore the awkward, formal optimism of the late 1920s. The woman smiled too widely, as though trying to prove something. Miss Marple recognized her at once. Time had added lines and softened the features, but there was no mistaking Mrs. Dane of Ivy Cottage. "Most interesting," she murmured, allowing the frame to slip back to its face-down position just as Slack turned. "Windows secure," he announced. No sign of entry or exit here. So either our murderer came through the door like any decent visitor, or he or she was already in the house. He moved toward the writing table by the wall and opened a small drawer. Bills, receipts, business correspondence. Nothing immediately suspicious. Another drawer yielded a neat stack of envelopes, each with a name written in a firm, decided hand. Harrington Wells, Dr. Pemberton, Mrs. Dane, Colonel Melchett, Simon. Inspector Slack whistled softly. Well now, letters for each of the dinner guests, and all sealed. We shall have to see what Mr. Blackwood was planning to say to his select circle. Miss Marple, who had drifted closer, observed that one envelope was missing from the otherwise precise arrangement. There was a faint impression in the dust where it had lain, slightly narrower than the others, as though it had been removed quite recently. A pity, she said almost to herself. One does like to see a set quite complete. Odd how people so often remove just the one piece that interests one most. Slack barely glanced at her. He was already summoning his constable to fetch Simon Blackwood and arranging for the 6 dinner guests to be interviewed in turn. As Miss Marple followed them back toward the hall, her gaze lingered for a moment on the faint, drying footprints that led away from the study toward the back of the house. Everyone, it seemed, was eager to look at who had reason to come to Theodore Blackwood. She was beginning to wonder who had been most anxious to leave. The late afternoon found the drawing room of Harrington Wells Manor transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber. Lady Charlotte Harrington Wells, thin, elegant, and perpetually strained, sat stiffly on a brocade settee, her lace handkerchief twisted between restless fingers. Her husband, Sir Reginald, stood by the fireplace, his broad back to the room as though he could physically shield himself from the inspector's questions. Inspector Slack, notebook at the ready, occupied an upright chair with the air of a man quite prepared to be unpleasant. Miss Marple, invited more by inevitability than design, had taken a modest seat near the window, where the soft light outlined the faint, fine wrinkles of her face and the steady precision of her knitting. "So," Slack began briskly, "you both attended dinner at Blackwood House last evening. What time did you leave?" "Shortly before 11, Sir Reginald replied without turning. "We walked home. It is hardly a journey that requires a carriage." "And you went straight home?" Slack's tone suggested that he would prefer any answer that allowed him to be suspicious. Lady Charlotte's hand trembled. "But of course, Inspector. We are not in the habit of wandering the countryside at night. I suffer terribly from my digestion, as the village well knows." "Indeed," Miss Marple put in gently, her needles clicking. "You had your peppermint water at dinner. I noticed Mrs. Clement fetched it from the sideboard herself. Such care for one's health is most admirable." Lady Charlotte glanced at her sharply, as though uncertain whether the remark concealed some deeper significance. "Yes," she said at last. "Mr. Blackwood was most attentive, too attentive, perhaps." "How do you mean?" demanded Slack. Sir Reginald finally turned, his florid face set in lines of weary irritation. "If you insist on raking everything up, Inspector, then let us be frank. Theodore had recently acquired certain documents, business-related, that he believed put him in an advantageous position regarding some past transactions of mine." "Advantageous?" Slack repeated. Blackwood's old associate gave a dry laugh. He liked to say he had the whip hand at last. "He invited us last night with the clear intention of enjoying his new superiority. Dropped veiled hints all through dinner about ethics, responsibility, debts long unpaid. It was tiresome." "Debts?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, almost apologetic. "Financial debts, or perhaps another kind?" Sir Reginald hesitated just a fraction too long. "That is no concern of yours, Miss Marple." "But it may be of concern to the person who killed him," she observed, as if merely thinking aloud. Inspector Slack seized on this. "These documents, would they affect your position, Sir Reginald? Your reputation, your estate?" Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. "They might cause temporary embarrassment, nothing more." Miss Marple had noticed, with apparently idle interest, that Lady Charlotte's handbag lay open on the table beside her. A corner of pale pink ribbon protruded from within, all too familiar after the scene in Theodore's study. When Lady Charlotte shifted, her fingers moved almost unconsciously to push the bag further away from the inspector's line of sight. "Last night," Lady Charlotte said suddenly, as though compelled by some inner urgency, "Theodore behaved abominably. After the dessert course, he made a little speech. He said that in this very room, within the week, truth would out and false positions topple. He looked at each of us in turn, as though assigning judgment. 'Each of you,' Miss Marple repeated softly. 'How very theatrical of him. Do you recall his exact words when he looked at you, Lady Charlotte?' The handkerchief twisted more tightly. 'He said, "Some houses stand on sand, some on stone, some on stolen ground. It is time the rightful owner reclaimed his due." I thought he meant our boundary dispute over the lower field, but now I wonder.' Inspector Slack scribbled furiously. 'So he was blackmailing you, in effect.' 'We never paid him a penny,' Sir Reginald snapped. 'I told him if he had anything to say, he could say it in court.' 'And yet,' Miss Marple remarked, apparently absorbed in counting stitches, "someone was sufficiently disturbed by the contents of one of his letters to remove it from his desk and carry it away in some haste. Pink ribbon can be so distinctive, don't you find?' Lady Charlotte gave a visible start, color draining from her already pale cheeks. For a moment, fear flared nakedly in her eyes before she controlled it. 'You cannot possibly imply,' she began. 'Oh no, indeed,' Miss Marple interrupted gently. 'I only thought how unfortunate it is when private matters become entangled in public tragedy. It makes everything so much more untidy.' Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. 'You'll both remain available for further questioning. And Lady Charlotte, I'd appreciate a look at that handbag before I go.' As he moved toward her, Miss Marple's gaze drifted, apparently idly, to the French windows opening onto the terrace. A faint smear of soil marked the edge of the carpet, and beyond it, the lawn showed the recent impression of a motor car's tires turning sharply in the night. Someone in this household, she reflected, had ventured out after their supposedly early and uneventful return. The question was whether they had driven toward Blackwood House, or away from a scene already prepared to deceive. The Harrington Welleses entered the morning room like actors stepping onto a hostile stage. Geoffrey's bulk seemed to fill the doorway, his ruddy face set in an expression of injured propriety, while Constance hovered a step behind, her gloved hands tight around a small, crocodile handbag. "Inspector," Geoffrey began before Slack could even greet him, "this is a most intolerable business. We were told we were needed merely to answer a few routine questions. I trust you do not seriously consider us suspects in this sordid affair." Inspector Slack eyed him in a way that suggested he considered everyone a suspect. "Routine or not, sir, murder has been done, and you were present at the last social gathering of the deceased. You and Mrs. Harrington Wells will kindly sit down and answer what I ask." Constance obeyed at once, sinking gracefully into a chair. Geoffrey hesitated a fraction longer, then followed, the deference of habit winning over his bluster. Miss Marple, from her unobtrusive corner, thought how very much like a certain retired manufacturer in Little Marbury he looked, bullying when secure, cautious when uncertain. "Let us begin with last night," Slack said. "How would you describe the general tone of Mr. Blackwood's dinner party?" Constance spoke first, her voice low but steady. "Unpleasant, Inspector. Theodore, Mr. Blackwood was not himself. He seemed to take positive pleasure in making cryptic remarks that put everyone ill at ease. He hinted, oh, how he hinted, that some among us had behaved very badly in the past, and that he finally had the means to expose them." Geoffrey shifted in his chair. "Idle theatricals, that's what it was. Theodore always enjoyed playing puppet master. If he thought he could frighten us into some concession over the Brookfield land dispute, he miscalculated badly. I told him as much when we spoke privately after dinner." "Ah, you did speak privately?" Inspector Slack pounced. "And what was the subject of that conversation, sir?" "Business," Geoffrey answered, a touch too quickly. The Brookfield boundary line, water rights, that sort of thing. He had threatened to produce certain documents, his word, not mine, which he claimed proved the original deed favored him. I informed him I would contest any such claim vigorously. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. Documents, proofs, a telegram, burned papers in the grate. Theodore seemed to have armed himself with quite an arsenal of evidence. "And did he show you these documents?" Slack asked. "No. He only smiled in that infuriating way of his and said that all would be revealed soon enough. Then he made some remark about how the sins of the fathers had a way of revisiting the children. Unpleasant nonsense." Constance's gloved hands clenched tighter. "It was not nonsense to me, Geoffrey. He looked directly at me when he said it." She turned to Miss Marple with a sudden, almost desperate appeal. "You must understand, Miss Marple, Theodore delighted in making people uncomfortable. It does not mean there was any truth to his insinuations. Human beings," Miss Marple said mildly, "often resent being reminded of things they would rather forget, even when such reminders are quite general. It is so much more disturbing when the reminder is very specific." Inspector Slack resumed. "Your movements after you left Blackwood House?" "We drove straight home," Geoffrey replied. "Arrived shortly before 10. We share a night maid with the Lathams next door. She saw us come in. We did not leave the house again." "Quite so," Constance added. "I went directly to bed with one of my powders. My digestion was unsettled." Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Clement's mention of peppermint water at dinner, and thought of another lady she had once known who took powders whenever her conscience troubled her more than her stomach. The vicar's clock in the lane outside chimed the half-hour, its sober sound carrying faintly through the open window. Almost on its heels came the crunch of another motor arriving. Through the net curtain, Miss Marple saw a smaller car pull up, a neat Morris, recently washed. Dr. Pemberton, the village's new physician, stepped out, his dark hair neatly parted, his expression grave. "Last of the set," murmured Miss Marple under her breath. 6 guests, all accounted for, all with reasons to resent Theodore Blackwood's threatened revelations. As the Harrington Welleses withdrew, Inspector Slack collected his notes with renewed energy. "Once I've spoken to the doctor, I'll have a very clear picture indeed," he announced pointedly, glancing at Miss Marple. "Clear enough, I fancy, to move on this case." Miss Marple bent over her knitting, a faint, almost indulgent smile touching her lips. In her experience, when men were most certain of their clarity, they tended to overlook the very small, very simple things that revealed the truth. And somewhere, among telegrams, half-burned documents, 30-year-old photographs, damp footprints, and 5 sealed envelopes with a mysterious 6th missing, there lay a small, simple thing that tied it all together. What she did not yet know, but fully expected, was that the next hours would bring some fresh disturbance, some second ripple in the calm surface of village life, without which the pattern might never quite reveal itself. The afternoon light had begun to fade into a sullen gray when Inspector Slack finally closed his notebook with an air of weary satisfaction. "Right," he announced. "That's all for now. I have more than enough to be going on with. Every one of them had a motive, and at least 2 had the opportunity." His gaze lingered on Geoffrey Harrington Wells and Dr. Pemberton in particular. Miss Marple, who had remained largely silent during the interviews, allowed her knitting to rest in her lap. "Such a pity," she said mildly, "that opportunity is so often confused with convenience. Murderers can be quite clever about arranging appearances, you know." Slack gave a snort. "Appearances or not, someone crept into this house last night with a carving knife and left Theodore Blackwood dead in his study. I'm not dealing with one of your village squabbles over jam recipes, Miss Marple." "No," she agreed, her blue eyes thoughtful. "This is more akin to those unpleasant matters in Gossington 2 summers ago. When people have allowed small acts of deception to accumulate over many years, one often finds they become quite desperate when threatened with exposure." Simon Blackwood, who had been hovering near the doorway, finally stepped into the room, his face drawn. "Inspector Slack, may I speak with you? There is something I ought to tell you. I've remembered something about last night." Slack turned sharply. Well, out with it then. Simon swallowed. After everyone left, Uncle asked me to join him in the study. He seemed almost exhilarated. He said everything was finally in place, that his little drama would reach its conclusion within 48 hours. Then he told me that certain people had wronged my father 30 years ago and that he intended to see those wrongs put right. He said the dinner was only the beginning. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their quiet work. Your father, Mr. Simon? I understood he died when you were quite young. He did, Simon replied, his voice softening. Uncle Theodore always claimed father was the victim of his own poor judgment, bad investments, foolish trust in the wrong people. But last night he said that wasn't the whole truth. He said my father had been ruined deliberately. And did he name these people? Inspector Slack demanded. Simon shook his head miserably. No. He seemed to be enjoying the suspense. He only said I'd know soon enough when everyone received their envelope. He'd prepared letters for each of the guests and one for me. He said if anything happened to him, those letters would tell all. Miss Marple's gaze flickered almost imperceptibly. The pink-ribboned envelopes on his desk, she murmured. 5 we saw, though the dust suggested a 6th had been removed. Letters, Slack repeated, eyes narrowing. And where are these letters now, Mr. Blackwood? I don't know. Simon looked genuinely distressed. They were on his desk last night when I went to bed around 11. I never saw them again. Most inconvenient, Miss Marple observed softly. When the dead have taken such pains to speak from beyond the grave, it is always disappointing when their voices are mislaid. Inspector Slack was about to retort when the front door banged open and a constable hurried in, cap askew, breathing hard from his run up the drive. Beg pardon, sir, he burst out, but there's trouble at Ivy Cottage. Mrs. Dane's maid sent me, says her mistress has taken something, sir. A whole bottle of chloral, by the look of it. Dr. Haydock's on his way, but they thought you ought to know. A sharp silence fell over the room. Miss Marple's needle stopped abruptly in mid-stitch. Attempting to cheat the gallows, is she? Slack muttered grimly. Miss Marple rose slowly, her face kind but very grave. Or perhaps, she said quietly, someone is very anxious that Mrs. Dane should not be in a position to answer further questions. Slack turned to her sharply. You think? I think, Inspector, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that when a person who has been threatened with exposure suddenly becomes both a suspect and a victim, it is seldom the result of coincidence. And if Mrs. Dane has indeed taken chloral, the question of who had access to her medicine cabinet this afternoon will become quite significant. Slack straightened. Very well. I'll go to Ivy Cottage at once. If I might suggest, Miss Marple added, her tone still mild, it would be wise to have someone remain here. These letters of Mr. Blackwood's, if they still exist, are the sort of thing a nervous murderer might be very anxious to find. Her eyes moved briefly, thoughtfully, from Simon to the Harrington Wells couple, then to Dr. Pemberton. Each face showed tension of a different sort, fear, calculation, desperation. Somewhere among them, she felt sure, was the hand that had held the carving knife, and perhaps the one that had measured out chloral into a glass at Ivy Cottage. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected as she gathered up her knitting, rarely changes. Only the circumstances do. Inspector Slack arrived in the kitchen with his usual air of brusque impatience, though even he paused at the sight of the pink-ribboned envelope bearing Mrs. Clement's name. "What the devil is this?" he demanded, stooping to peer at it. Another of Blackwood's little surprises? "It appears so," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I fancy this one was not where Mr. Blackwood originally left it. Mrs. Clement, you are quite sure it was not on the table when you went to the pantry?" "Quite sure, Miss Marple," the housekeeper replied, still shaking. "I'd have noticed that I would. I only left the room for a moment to fetch more sugar. When I came back, there it was, and I dropped the cup from pure fright." Slack scanned the room, his eyes narrowing. So someone entered the kitchen, placed this letter, and slipped away again without being seen, and very recently too. Miss Marple's gaze rested thoughtfully on the doorway. The house has been most busy this afternoon. Guests coming and going, inspector interviewing. It would be most easy for someone to slip away for a moment, especially if they had a particular reason to ensure Mrs. Clement saw that envelope. Reason? Slack snorted. Looks to me like more blackmail letters. Perhaps this one explains why our respectable housekeeper might have wanted her employer out of the way. Mrs. Clement's indignation briefly overcame her terror. I've served Mr. Blackwood faithful nigh on 20 years, Inspector, and I'll not have you implying— No one is implying anything, my dear, Miss Marple soothed. We are merely observing that someone wished you to know Mr. Blackwood had prepared a letter for you. A letter which has now had its contents removed. Slack straightened with a muttered oath. Fingerprints, that's what we need. I'll have the envelope sent to the lab in Much Benham. Miss Marple said nothing, but her gentle expression concealed a private doubt, people in St. Mary Mead rarely wore gloves indoors. The tiny pearl button she had found in the flower bed suggested someone had. Gloved hands left no fingerprints at all. Later, back in the morning room, the atmosphere had thickened into something close to suffocation. All 6 dinner guests now sat together, the Harrington Wells couple, Mrs. Dane, Colonel Melchett, Dr. Pemberton, and Simon, each wrapped in their own particular brand of defensiveness. Only Miss Marple seemed completely at ease, her knitting needles clicking softly as though murder and 30-year-old secrets were of no great consequence. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Right, let's have it plain. Theodore Blackwood entertained you all last night. Today he's lying in the mortuary with one of his own carving knives in his back. Each of you had reason to fear him. Money, reputation, the law. You all stood to lose something if Blackwood carried out his threats. Geoffrey Harrington Wells shifted uncomfortably. Really, Inspector? Really, Mr. Harrington Wells? Slack cut in sharply. You lied about your movements last night. Your wife says you went out between 12:30 and 3. That gives you ample time to pay Mr. Blackwood a visit. And what about you, Inspector? Constance snapped suddenly. Are you quite certain your energies are best spent badgering my husband when there are far more likely suspects present? Her gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, in Mrs. Dane's direction. Miss Marple did not miss it. If you have something to say, Mrs. Harrington Wells, Miss Marple said gently, it is often much better to say it plainly. Secrets, I have found, only fester when kept too long. Constance's composure wavered. Very well, she said tightly. Mrs. Dane left the dinner table twice last night, once during the fish course, once after coffee. She claimed she was feeling unwell, but she was gone far longer than a simple attack of nerves would require. All eyes turned to Mrs. Dane, whose expression hardened. And what of you, Constance? You trembled so violently when Theodore mentioned Brighton that you dropped your fork. I saw your face. I wasn't the only one afraid of what he might reveal. Brighton, Miss Marple repeated softly, her voice almost dreamy. Such a lively place in the summer of 1895, I've always heard. Sea air, flirtations on the pier, and sometimes quite unfortunate incidents that respectable people prefer to forget. Dr. Pemberton spoke abruptly, his nerves finally fraying. This is absurd. We're talking about events 30 years past. Whatever happened then, it can hardly justify murder now. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied, her tone still mild. I have often observed that the past has a most inconvenient way of refusing to remain buried. A stolen identity, for instance, might go undetected for decades, until someone decides to look rather closely at old photographs. There was a sudden, almost imperceptible movement from one of the seated figures, a tightening of the shoulders, the faintest flinch, as though a nerve had been struck, unexpectedly deep. Miss Marple's eyes, though apparently engrossed in her knitting, had been waiting for precisely that reaction. The following days in St. Mary Mead unfolded with a peculiar blend of routine and quiet shock that Miss Marple had observed so often before. Life resumed its familiar rhythms. The post was delivered, the grocer's boy whistled on his bicycle, and the church bells rang as usual. Yet beneath it all, the village hummed with a subdued awareness that something irrevocable had occurred. At the Blue Boar, voices dropped when Colonel Melchett's name was mentioned. Men who had once deferred to his opinions on military matters and village committees now spoke of him in low tones, half appalled and half fascinated. At the same time, an odd, almost guilty sympathy for him emerged. It is difficult, Miss Marple reflected, for people to entirely condemn someone they have admired for so long, even when confronted with the dreadful reality of their crime. Dolly Bantry wasted no time in coming to see Miss Marple. She arrived at the thatched cottage late one morning, cheeks flushed, brimming with questions and only minimally disguised concern. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she said, barely waiting to be shown into the sitting room. "Slack is strutting about the village like a rooster, but of course he's telling the story all wrong. I simply cannot make sense of half of it." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual calm precision. "I do not think you are alone in that, Dolly. It is not a pleasant story." "No murder ever is pleasant," Mrs. Bantry retorted briskly, though her eyes were troubled. "But the Colonel, of all people, I cannot reconcile it. He chaired the War Memorial Fund. He organized the charity ball. And once," Miss Marple said gently, "he was a very handsome young man in Brighton, with a life ahead of him and a terror of scandal that outweighed his understanding of right and wrong." "But 30 years, Jane," Dolly shook her head. "To carry it that long, and then kill to keep it hidden." Miss Marple's knitting needles began their soft clicking. "It is extraordinary how long people can live with guilt if they have wrapped it sufficiently in rationalizations." Colonel Melchett told himself, I think, that he had saved many lives by ensuring his own career and influence remained intact. That is the worst kind of self-deception, the moral one. "And the others?" Dolly demanded. "Mrs. Dane, if that is her name, Constance Harrington Wells, Dr. Pemberton. What will become of them?" "They will live," Miss Marple said quietly. "But not as they did before. The truth has a way of fraying the edges of comfortably woven lives. Geoffrey Harrington Wells will be forced into a more modest existence once Theodore's solicitor begins sorting his effects. The business with the loan cannot be kept entirely quiet now. As for Mrs. Dane, her assumed widowhood will be a matter of gossip for months." "And Dr. Pemberton?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "He has, at least, what he most desired, the truth about his father. It is a terrible truth, but an honest one. I fancy he will stay, St. Mary Mead is quite used to flaws in its inhabitants, once properly catalogued, and he has shown some courage in confronting his past." Dolly sipped her tea, considering. "And Simon Blackwood, a lonely young man," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant, "who has inherited not only an estate, but a legacy of unhappiness. But perhaps he will do better than his uncle. Theodore never truly understood that justice sought for its own sake, without mercy, becomes simply another form of cruelty." For a little while they were silent, listening to the faint sounds of village life drifting through the open window. The rattle of a cart, the distant call of children at play. "You saw it so early, didn't you, Jane?" Dolly said at last. "It wasn't just Slack's silly insistence on Simon and the inheritance. You never believed it was about the money." "No," Miss Marple admitted. "Murders over money are, in my experience, rarely so elaborate. All this careful staging, the knife, the window, the burned papers, spoke of someone used to strategy. And then there was the Colonel's reaction when Brighton was first mentioned. Not just fear, but the sort of tightness one sees in men who have kept discipline over themselves for far too long." "You always come back to that human nature," Dolly said, half affectionate, half exasperated. "It is all we truly have to go on," Miss Marple replied. "Fingerprints and revolvers and scientific tests may be very impressive, but it is in small human things that murderers give themselves away. A word too quickly spoken, a glance, too long avoided, the way someone speaks of the dead before they quite ought to know. Dolly sighed, setting down her cup. Well, I suppose we must make do with less exciting matters now. The Harvest Festival is next week, and Mrs. Price is in a state over the flower arrangements. I have always found, Miss Marple said gently, that after murder, there is nothing more comforting than ordinary fussing over flowers. After Dolly had gone, the cottage grew very quiet. Miss Marple sat a while longer with her knitting, thinking of a young man in Brighton, a drowned girl, a destroyed letter, and a middle-aged colonel who had tried very hard, for 30 years, to believe himself a good man. At last, she rose and went into her small garden, where the September roses were beginning to fade. She deadheaded a bloom here and there with careful fingers. Life, she reflected, was very much like gardening. One uprooted what was diseased, pruned what had grown wild, and tried as best one could to make things neat and decent again. But some roots went too deep ever to be fully removed. One had to accept sometimes that the past would always lie beneath the surface. Quiet, but never quite gone. In St. Mary Mead, the curtains would twitch a little less each day. Gossip would soften into anecdote, and the villagers would eventually speak of that Blackwood business as something safely tucked into the past. Only Miss Marple, perhaps, would remember it as a lesson in how far people will go to protect the stories they tell about themselves, and how, even after 30 years, truth will insist on having the last word. The weeks that followed settled over St. Mary Mead like a fine autumn mist, softening the edges of recent horrors without quite obscuring them. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. The clatter of milk bottles at dawn, the vicar's bicycle along the lane, the distant echo of children's shouts on their way home from school. Yet beneath the surface, conversation paused more often than it used to when certain names were mentioned, and eyes turned, almost unconsciously, toward the Blackwood house. Now, standing strangely silent behind its yew hedges, Miss Marple, who never allowed murder to interrupt her domestic routines more than strictly necessary, spent her mornings much as she always had, tending to her small garden, corresponding with far-flung nieces, and knitting steadily through the long October evenings. Only those who knew her well would have noticed the occasional faraway look in her mild blue eyes, the inward gaze of someone rewalking old paths in her mind, checking that every step had been sound. It was on one such afternoon, with weak sunlight slanting across the lace curtains, that Dr. Pemberton came to call. He stood in the doorway awkwardly, hat in hand, the usual professional reserve stripped away. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he began, settling on the edge of the chair she indicated. "It seems oddly heartless to speak of gratitude where so much pain is concerned, but without you, I might never have known the truth about my father." Miss Marple's needles moved calmly. "It was a most unhappy truth," she said gently. "One always hopes, I think, to discover that the dead were better than one feared, not worse. But in your case, Dr. Pemberton, I should say your father comes out rather nobly." "Nobly?" He looked startled. "But of course, a weak man would have accepted the silence and lived comfortably on. Your father tried to confess. It was others who suppressed his letter and used his conscience against him. He bore the weight of guilt that should have been shared." Pemberton's shoulders eased fractionally. "The inquiry in Brighton has reopened the old inquest, you know, with Mrs. Clement's testimony and the diary. The official verdict has been amended. My father's role is rather differently understood now." "Then that," Miss Marple said, "is something. Truth comes late, often, but it is still truth." He hesitated. "And Simon?" "Simon will be tried as an accessory before the fact," Miss Marple replied quietly. There is a certain irony there. He thought himself so clever, arranging circumstances, unlocking doors, placing temptations where weaker men might stumble. But human nature is sadly predictable, once one has watched it for many years. He relied upon the colonel's pride and desperation, and both behaved just as one might expect. Pemberton studied her with a kind of rueful wonder. "You saw all that simply from how they spoke, how they looked?" Not simply, she corrected mildly. From how they spoke compared with what they did. People are always telling one-tiny truths about themselves, you know. The Colonel's immediate acceptance of guilt, his eagerness almost, told me he had been expecting a reckoning for years. Simon, on the other hand, protested too neatly at all the right moments, yet never asked the one question an innocent man invariably asks. "And what question is that?" Pemberton asked. "Why?" Miss Marple's eyes met his. "Not why me, or why suspect me, but why should anyone want to kill Uncle Theodore?" Simon never expressed genuine bewilderment at the murder itself, only anxiety about how it might affect him. Pemberton was silent for a moment, then rose. "I hope, in time, this village will think of my father as more than a shadow over an old scandal." "Oh, I dare say it will," Miss Marple replied. "Villages are very hard on strangers, but surprisingly forgiving of the dead, once all is properly explained." After he left, the quiet of the little sitting room seemed to deepen. A few minutes later, Mrs. Bantry arrived, her eyes alight with the sort of indignation that depends for its strength on secret enjoyment. "Well, Jane, the whole thing is in the papers now," she announced, discarding her gloves. "Column after column about Brighton and conspiracies and legacies. They do make rather a meal of it in London. 6 guests and a funeral," one headline said. "Most distasteful, I thought. Though I must admit it does have a certain ring." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Newspapers must have their little dramas, Dolly. It keeps the world turning. And you, sitting here all the while with your knitting, Mrs. Bantry said, half affectionate, half exasperated. "You might at least look a trifle more triumphant. You've untangled 30 years of secrets and sent not one, but 2 men to answer for their sins." "Tut, tut," Miss Marple chided gently. "It is not a question of triumph. There is really nothing to be proud of in seeing how wicked people can be. One simply does one's best to see that wickedness is stopped when it goes too far." Mrs. Bantry sighed, sinking back. "I suppose so. Still, St. Mary Mead will be quite dull after this." "I should not count on it," Miss Marple said mildly. "Human nature is very much the same everywhere, whether in a grand hotel in Brighton or a quiet lane in St. Mary Mead. There will always be jealousies and secrets and little deceits. Only one hopes, without knives in studies and 30-year-old ghosts to urge them on." As evening gathered and Mrs. Bantry took her leave, Miss Marple crossed to her window and looked out at the little world she knew so well. The vicar's cat slunk along the wall, a maid at the Green Man laughed with a delivery boy, and a cyclist wobbled slightly as he lifted his hat to Miss Weatherby. Ordinary life, yet beneath it all the same currents as ever. Vanity, fear, love, resentment, hope. She drew the curtain and returned to her chair, setting her knitting neatly in her lap. Somewhere in the distance the church clock chimed the hour. 6 guests and a funeral, she said softly to herself. And in the end, only human nature, just as one sees it every day in very small ways, if one only pays attention. Then, with a small, decisive nod, Miss Marple picked up her needles and began a new pattern.